My name is Margaret Hayes, and I'm 57 years old. My world changed forever the day I lost James, my husband, the love of my life. It's strange. You know, how life seems to shift in an instant. How a single moment can leave you drifting, untethered, and lost. That's how it felt when the doctors told me he was gone, his body cold. His life abruptly snuffed out by a heart attack. And I was left standing in a world that no longer made sense. He was the center of my universe. And without him, everything seemed empty, I suppose. In some way, grief is like the sea. It pulls you under, swallows you whole, and yet it continues to ebb and flow. Its tide coming back every now and then to remind you of what you've lost. I had been navigating this uncharted territory for months after his death, unsure of how to continue living without him. The house was too quiet, the days too long, and I often found myself reaching for the phone, half expecting James to walk through the door with his warm smile, his gentle laugh, and that familiar way of saying, "I'm home." But he never did. I found solace, of all places, in Willowbrook Cemetery. It may sound odd, but it was the one place that made sense to me. The graveyard, with its stone markers and old oaks, felt like a quiet refuge where I could go to visit him, though he wasn't really there. I'd stand by his grave, speaking to him as though he could hear me, recounting stories of our life together. The days of our first date when we had laughed in a little cafe. The moments we had spent walking in the park with no particular destination in mind. Our shared dreams of the future that would never come. I told him everything. Even the little things that mattered to me now. It was my way of keeping him alive. A way to stay connected to a life that felt increasingly distant. Every day, without fail, I would make my way to the cemetery. There was something about those visits, a mix of comfort and pain, that seemed to anchor me. The pain of loss, of course, was always present, but it became a little more bearable each time. I would bring fresh flowers, tulips, his favorite, arranged neatly in a vase by his stone. I would talk to him about the events of my day, even though I knew it was pointless. But somehow, it felt right. I didn't mind that it was just me, alone in the cemetery, with only the sound of rustling leaves and birds chirping to keep me company. One afternoon, as I stood there beside James's grave, something unusual caught my eye, a small figure in the distance. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, or perhaps an illusion brought on by the quiet of the cemetery. But when I looked again, I saw a little girl, standing at the far end of the graveyard. She wore a pale pink dress, and her hair, dark and loose, swayed gently in the breeze. She stood motionless, gazing at James's headstone as if she knew something I didn't. It was a curious sight, and though I couldn't explain why, I felt a sudden stirring in my chest, a feeling of unease, mixed with something else I couldn't quite place. The girl was so small, almost ethereal in the late afternoon light. Her presence in that graveyard feeling so out of place. I called out to her, wondering if she needed help, but she didn't respond. Her movements were deliberate, as though she had come here for a purpose, something I couldn't understand. She remained by the grave for several moments, her little hands clutching a bunch of wildflowers. Then, she turned and walked away, vanishing between the rows of graves as quickly as she had appeared. I stood there for a long time, staring at the spot where she had been. It was an odd feeling, one I couldn't shake. I had no idea who she was or why she was there, but something about her visit unsettled me deeply. It wasn't just the girl's strange behavior, but the sense of connection I felt in that moment, a connection I couldn't explain. The next day, as I made my way to the cemetery once again, I couldn't help but wonder if I would see her again. The girl in the pink dress. Would she be there, standing silently at James's grave? I didn't know why I cared, but I did. It felt like there was something I needed to understand, a piece of the puzzle I hadn't yet uncovered. As I entered the cemetery that afternoon, I scanned the area for any sign of the little girl. And there, just as I had hoped, she was standing once again by James's grave. This time, she was kneeling down and gently laying the wildflowers she had been holding on the ground, carefully arranging them in front of the headstone. Her small hands moved delicately, almost reverently, as though she were paying tribute to something or someone that was deeply meaningful to her. I watched in silence, my heart heavy with emotion. There was something profoundly touching about her gesture, something that made my chest tighten with a mix of sorrow and confusion. I wasn't sure what to do. Should I approach her? Should I ask her who she was? What she was doing here? But before I could make up my mind, the girl stood up abruptly, her eyes wide with fear as she noticed me watching her. Without a word, she turned and fled, disappearing between the gravestones as quickly as she had come. My heart raced in my chest, and I found myself rooted to the spot. The girl was gone, but the questions lingered. Who was she? Why had she come to James's grave? What connection did she have to him? I had never seen her before, and yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something important I was meant to understand about her presence in that place. It was then that I realized that my grief, which had consumed me for so long, had begun to give way to something else, a sense of curiosity, a desire to uncover the truth about this little girl and her mysterious visits to James's grave. I didn't know where this journey would take me, but I knew one thing for certain: my life, which had felt so still and stagnant in the wake of James's death, was about to take a turn I never could have imagined. And so, with a renewed sense of purpose, I resolved to find answers. The grief that had once held me captive was now accompanied by something else: the need to know. And perhaps, just perhaps, the answers I sought would give me the peace I had been longing for. The next day, I couldn't shake the image of the little girl in the pink dress. Her face, so fragile and fleeting, was etched in my mind. I woke up earlier than usual, my heart pounding with a strange excitement, the kind that usually comes before a discovery, or the possibility of one. I had to know who she was. Why had she come to my husband's grave? What was her connection to James? These questions gnawed at me, persistent and unrelenting. I dressed quickly and made my way to Willowbrook Cemetery. The air was crisp, the morning stillness broken only by the soft rustling of leaves. As I walked past the rows of gravestones, I felt a strange sense of urgency. The place, so familiar and comforting to me before, now felt like a vast, empty space filled with unanswered questions. Would the girl be there again today? When I arrived at James's grave, I stood for a moment, gazing at his name etched into the stone, the dates marking the beginning and end of his life. My chest tightened as I thought of him. He had always been the rock in my life, the one constant I could rely on. And now he was gone. His death left a void in me, one I wasn't sure how to fill. And then, just as I had hoped, I saw her standing there again. The little girl was kneeling at the foot of James's grave, her small hands once again carefully placing a bouquet of white wildflowers. Her presence was so quiet, so reverent, that I almost felt like I was intruding just by watching. But I couldn't look away. There was something about her that drew me in, something gentle and familiar in the way she interacted with the grave, as though she had been doing it for years. I took a few tentative steps closer, my heart racing in my chest. I had to speak to her. I had to know who she was. But as I got closer, she seemed to sense my presence. She looked up, her wide, brown eyes locking with mine, and for a brief moment, I saw a flash of something in her gaze, a mixture of surprise, fear, and something else I couldn't quite place. She stood up quickly, dropping the remaining flowers, and took a step back, as though ready to run. I froze. This was the moment I had been waiting for, but I couldn't bring myself to speak. What would I say? How could I explain that I had been watching her from a distance? That I was now standing on the edge of a mystery I had no idea how to solve? Before I could gather my thoughts, She turned and fled, her footsteps quick and light, vanishing into the maze of gravestones. I stood there, a mixture of frustration and confusion bubbling up inside me. She had disappeared again, just as she had the day before. But this time, I was more determined than ever to find out who she was. I bent down to pick up the wildflowers she had dropped. They were simple, white blossoms, delicate and fragile. As I held them in my hand, I felt a strange warmth spread through me, as though there was some unseen connection between the flowers and the girl. I could feel my curiosity deepen, pulling me in a direction I hadn't anticipated. I decided to visit the cemetery more frequently in the days that followed, hoping for another glimpse of her. And each time I returned, I would find her there, placing wildflowers at James's grave. She seemed to appear at the same time every day, always dressed in that same worn pink dress, always with the same quiet reverence for the grave. And yet, she never spoke a word to me, never acknowledged my presence. I would watch from a distance, always too afraid to approach, unsure of how to break the silence. But one day, after several visits, I finally saw something that made my heart stop. The little girl, Emily as I would come to know her, stood beside James's grave, her hands trembling slightly as she placed the last of the flowers. She looked up at the sky for a moment, her face softened by a sadness that mirrored my own. And then, for the first time, she spoke. "Thank you," she whispered, as if she was speaking directly to James. "I'll never forget you." The words were barely audible, but they hit me like a wave crashing over me. Who was this child? And what connection did she have to my husband? It was clear that she wasn't just some wandering child. There was something deeply personal about her visits. Something that made her feel like a part of my life I hadn't yet discovered. As I stood there, still holding the wildflowers in my hands, I knew that the mystery of the girl in the pink dress was far from over. I needed to understand her story, to unravel the truth behind her visits to James's grave. There was a part of me, a part one had buried beneath my grief, that felt a strange sense of hope rise within me. Perhaps this little girl, in some way, could help me understand not just James's death, but the life we had shared and the one that was still waiting to unfold. The days turned into weeks, and my routine began to revolve around the cemetery and the mysterious girl. I found myself waking each morning with a peculiar sense of anticipation, as though my life, previously steeped in sorrow, had been infused with a new purpose. The weight of grief still lingered, its heaviness tugged at my heart, but now, curiosity was entwined with it, creating a delicate balance between mourning and wonder. Each time I saw her, the girl in the pink dress, my fascination grew. She moved with such purpose, her small figure always cradling that same bundle of wildflowers, her demeanor quiet but intentional. Watching her became part of my ritual. I didn't feel as though I was intruding anymore. Rather, I felt as though I was bearing witness to something important. Something that might help me understand not only her but also James. James. Even his name felt different now, as though the letters carried a secret I had yet to uncover. My memories of him were vivid and untarnished, his infectious laugh, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the warmth of his hand in mine. But in the face of this enigma, I began to wonder if there were parts of his life I had never truly known. Was it possible that James had harbored something so significant, so deeply personal, that it had never reached me? One afternoon, as I sat on the bench near his grave, my thoughts wandered back to our years together. James had always been full of surprises. He loved making grand gestures, like the time he filled our living room with candles and music for our anniversary, or when he secretly enrolled us in a cooking class because he wanted to spice things up. I chuckled at the memory, the sound of my laughter unfamiliar and jarring in the quiet expanse of the cemetery. But then I thought of the times James seemed lost in thought, those rare moments when his exuberance dimmed and a shadow crossed his face. I had always brushed it off, thinking it was work stress or a passing mood. Now, Though I couldn't help but wonder if those moments had been connected to this girl or to something even bigger that I had never noticed. The following day, I decided I could no longer keep my distance. When the girl appeared at James's grave, I stood from the bench and approached her carefully. My steps were deliberate, my heart pounding as though it would burst. She was placing another bouquet of white wildflowers, her small hands arranging them with a tenderness that brought tears to my eyes. "Hello," I said softly, my voice trembling. She flinched but didn't run this time. Slowly, she turned to look at me, up close. I could see the wear in her pink dress, the faded hem and the patches sewn into the fabric. Her eyes, wide and cautious, met mine. "Who are you?" I asked gently, trying to keep my tone as warm as possible. "Why do you come here?" She hesitated, clutching the empty stems of the flowers tightly in her hands. For a moment, I thought she might answer, but instead, her lips quivered, and she took a step back. Before I could say anything more, she turned and darted away, disappearing between the gravestones once again. I stood there, staring at the space she had occupied just seconds before, my heart sinking with frustration. But as I looked down, I noticed something she had left behind: a tiny ribbon, once tied around the bouquet, now lying in the grass. I picked it up, the material soft and delicate in my hands. It was pink, like her dress, but frayed and slightly torn. As I held it, I felt a strange connection to the girl, as though this small object was a bridge between her world and mine. I resolved then and there that I wouldn't stop until I understood her story. There was something deeply meaningful about her presence, something that tied her to James and, by extension, to me. Her visits weren't random, they carried a purpose, a message I had yet to decipher. My days at the cemetery became less about mourning and more about searching. The sorrow that had once consumed me now shared space with determination and curiosity. For the first time since James's death, I felt a flicker of hope that this mystery might lead me to something greater, something that could give my life new meaning. As I walked home that evening, the ribbon still clutched in my hand, I realized that grief and curiosity were no longer opposing forces within me. Instead, they had woven themselves together into a single thread, pulling me forward toward answers I hadn't known I was searching for. Sleep was elusive that night. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling as questions swirled through my mind. Who was the girl? Why did she visit James's grave with such devotion? What had James kept from me that tied him to this child? Every thought seemed to lead me back to James's familiar smile. And yet, now there was something unfamiliar lurking behind it, a shadow I couldn't ignore. When I finally drifted into slumber, my dreams were vivid and unsettling. James was there, standing under the oak tree near our favorite picnic spot, his face soft with the same gentle expression I had fallen in love with. But beside him stood the girl in the pink dress. She held his hand tightly, her head tilted toward him as if she trusted him with her whole being. I tried to call out to them, but my voice wouldn't come. The dream faded, leaving behind an ache in my chest that lingered even as I woke. The next morning, I knew I couldn't let the day slip by without seeking answers. I returned to Willowbrook Cemetery earlier than usual, the air cool and damp with the promise of rain. James's grave felt as familiar as ever, but now it also felt like the epicenter of a puzzle I was desperate to solve. I didn't have to wait long. The girl appeared again, emerging from between the headstones like a ghost from another world. This time, I didn't hesitate. As she placed her flowers at James's grave, I stepped forward quickly but carefully. "Please, don't run," I said, my voice as steady as I could make it. She froze, her small frame stiff with tension. Slowly, she turned to look at me. Her eyes were wide, wary, and startlingly expressive for someone so young. "It's okay," I continued, kneeling slightly to meet her gaze. "I'm not here to hurt you. I just want to know why you come here." The girl's lips parted as if she might speak. But no sound came out. I waited, my heart thudding in the quiet. She seemed to be weighing something, her gaze flicking between me and the grave. Finally, she whispered, "He was kind to me." The words hit me like a wave, simple yet profound. My breath caught as I tried to process what she had said. "Kind?" I asked, leaning closer. "How did you know him?" The girl hesitated again, her small hands fidgeting with the hem of her dress. "He came to visit me. At the home." "The home?" I repeated, confusion swirling with the faintest glimmer of understanding. Her head nodded, her expression softening slightly. "Lakeside Orphanage. He brought me flowers and talked to me," he said, her voice faltered, and her gaze dropped to the ground. "What did he say?" I pressed gently, my voice barely above a whisper. She looked up at me then, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "He said he wanted me to have a family. That maybe I could be his little girl someday." I couldn't breathe. The air around me seemed to vanish as her words sank in. James had visited her? James, my James, had been planning to adopt this child? I didn't know, I murmured, more to myself than to her. My legs felt unsteady, and I sank onto the bench, my mind racing. The girl stepped closer, her apprehension seeming to give way to something gentler, perhaps even trust. "He said he was going to bring someone special to meet me." But then, her voice broke, and she looked down again, her small shoulders trembling. I understood without her needing to finish. James had died before he could fulfill his promise. The weight of it settled over me like a blanket of sorrow and guilt. Had I been so consumed by my own grief that I'd overlooked something this monumental? The girl looked up at me once more, her expression timid but hopeful. "Are you her? The special person he wanted me to meet?" Her question hung in the air, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. A part of me wanted to say yes, to assure her that I could step into the role James had envisioned. But another part of me hesitated, overwhelmed by the sudden, profound shift in my understanding of James's life and my own. I didn't have all the answers yet, but one thing was clear: I needed to know more. And I needed to know it soon. "Can you show me the home?" I asked her, my voice firm despite the storm of emotions within me. She nodded, her lips curving into the faintest hint of a smile. It was the beginning of something I didn't yet fully comprehend but knew I had to see through. And so, together, we left the cemetery, walking toward the truth that awaited us at Lakeside Orphanage. The walk to Lakeside Orphanage was quiet, broken only by the sound of our footsteps on the gravel path. The girl, Emily, as she finally introduced herself, stayed close but kept her eyes on the ground, her small hands clasped in front of her. I found myself studying her, noticing how her faded pink dress seemed to hang loosely on her delicate frame, the frayed hem brushing her knees. She couldn't have been more than 8 years old, but her demeanor carried a weight that didn't belong on a child's shoulders. The orphanage came into view as we rounded a corner. It was an old building, its brick walls weathered and ivy creeping along its sides. A modest sign reading Lakeside Orphanage swung gently in the breeze, creaking with each movement. Emily led me to the entrance and hesitated, glancing back at me with a flicker of uncertainty. "It's okay," I said softly, offering her a reassuring smile. "I'll be right here." She pushed the door open, and we stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of floor polish and paper, with a warmth that spoke of simple comforts. Children's laughter echoed faintly from somewhere down the hall, a sound both joyous and haunting. Emily led me to an office at the end of the corridor, where a woman sat behind a desk, sorting through a stack of files. The woman looked up as we entered, her brow furrowing in confusion before softening into a polite smile. She was in her 60s, her silver-streaked hair pulled into a neat bun, and her nameplate identified her as Mrs. Andrews. "Emily," she said warmly, though there was a trace of surprise in her tone. "What brings you back so soon?" Emily glanced at me, her silence making it clear she expected me to speak. I wanted to learn more about her connection to my husband, I said, hesitating as I tried to find the right words. James Hayes. He used to visit here, didn't he? Mrs. Andrews's expression changed instantly. Her smile faded, replaced by something akin to recognition and sorrow. She gestured for me to sit, her gaze moving to Emily with a silent invitation to stay. Emily perched on the edge of the chair next to mine, her small hands clutching each other tightly. James spoke of you often, Mrs. Andrews began, her voice soft but deliberate. He cared deeply for this little girl, for all the children here, really, but especially for Emily. He saw her as family. The word struck me with an almost physical force. Family? I echoed, my voice faint. Mrs. Andrews nodded. James visited regularly. He brought flowers, books, and sometimes little treats. But more than that, he gave Emily hope. He'd confided in me that he was planning to adopt her, to give her the home and love she so desperately needed. He said it was going to be a surprise for you, a way to fulfill the dream you'd both shared. Tears welled in my eyes. Memories of quiet conversations with James about wanting children, and the heartache of realizing it might never happen, flooded my mind. He had been listening. He had been dreaming alongside me, silently building a future that he never had the chance to share. I didn't know, I murmured, my voice breaking. Mrs. Andrews's gaze softened. He wanted it to be perfect before he told you. And then, when he passed, we were all devastated. Emily most of all. I turned to look at Emily, who was staring at her lap, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. In that moment, the enormity of what James had planned and the depth of his love hit me fully. He had seen something in Emily, something worth fighting for, and now it was my turn to honor that. I want to know more, I said, looking back at Mrs. Andrews with newfound determination. About James. About Emily. About everything. Mrs. Andrews smiled faintly, her eyes reflecting a mix of sadness and hope. Then let me show you, she said. Standing. She led us to a small, bright room at the back of the orphanage. It was modest but filled with warmth. On a table sat a vase of fresh white flowers, James's unmistakable touch, and the walls were decorated with hand-drawn pictures, each one featuring a man unmistakably resembling James, always smiling alongside a little girl. Emily stepped forward, touching the drawings with reverence. He told me I was special, she whispered, that I deserved a family. My chest tightened. James had seen the best in Emily, and in his quiet, thoughtful way, he had given her a piece of himself that I hadn't even known existed. Standing in that room, surrounded by evidence of James's unwavering kindness, I felt a profound shift within me. This wasn't just about discovering the past, it was about embracing the future James had envisioned for us. I turned to Emily, my voice steady despite the tears threatening to fall. I think James was right. Emily, you do deserve a family, and I'd like to be that for you, if you'll let me. Emily looked at me, her expression a mixture of surprise, hope, and vulnerability. Really, she whispered, her voice trembling. Really, I said, my heart full. We'll figure it out together. Her small hand slipped into mine, tentative but full of trust. And in that moment, I knew that James's dream wasn't lost. It was just beginning. That evening, as I walked home from the orphanage, Emily's small hand still clasped in mine. A strange yet comforting sensation settled over me, a blend of sorrow and hope, of endings and beginnings. The weight of James's secret, now unveiled, lingered, but it no longer felt like a burden. Instead, it felt like a gift, one he had left for me to open at just the right moment. Emily was quiet as we entered my home, her eyes darting around the rooms as if trying to understand this unfamiliar space. It struck me how overwhelming this must be for her, a child who had known nothing but the walls of the orphanage. I knelt beside her and said gently, "This is your home now, Emily. You can take your time to feel comfortable here." She nodded but didn't speak. I gave her space, guiding her to the kitchen, where the smell of the apple pie I had baked earlier still lingered faintly in the air. I remembered James's love for that pie and wondered if he had ever told Emily about it. "Would you like some pie?" I asked, hoping to break through her cautious reserve. Her eyes lit up briefly, and she nodded again. I smiled, cutting her a generous slice and setting it on the table. She ate slowly, savoring each bite. And for the first time since we'd left the orphanage, I saw her shoulders relax. As the evening wore on, I took Emily upstairs to show her the room I had hastily prepared earlier that day. It was simple, fresh linens on the bed, a soft rug on the floor, and a small shelf where I'd placed a few books I thought she might like. I wasn't sure if it would be enough, but when she stepped inside, her eyes widened, and a faint smile tugged at her lips. "This is, for me?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Yes," I said. "It's your space now. You can decorate it however you'd like. Make it your own." She walked over to the bed, running her fingers over the quilt. "I never had my own room before," she murmured. Her words struck me deeply, and I felt a pang of sadness for all the things she had never known: the security, the love, the sense of belonging that every child deserved. "You have one now," I said firmly, "and you're not alone anymore." Emily turned to me then, her eyes full of something I couldn't quite place: gratitude, perhaps, or hope mixed with uncertainty. She didn't say anything, but she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around me. I froze for a moment, startled by the sudden display of affection, before gently hugging her back. As I held her, I thought of James and the quiet strength he had carried. Even in his final days, he had seen something in Emily, something I was only beginning to understand. I whispered a silent thank you to him, vowing to honor the trust he had placed in me. Later that night, after Emily had settled into bed, I sat by the window in my room, looking out at the star-filled sky. The grief of losing James was still there, but it no longer consumed me. In its place was something new: a sense of purpose, of connection, of love that had not ended with his death but had transformed into something else entirely. For the first time in months, I felt a flicker of hope. James's dream of a family was not gone. It was alive, and it was growing, one small step at a time. As I turned off the light and prepared for bed, I thought of the days ahead. They wouldn't be easy. Emily and I were both navigating uncharted territory, but I believed we could face them together. James had given me the courage to open my heart again, and in doing so, he had given both Emily and me a chance for a new beginning. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the kitchen window as I poured myself a cup of coffee. For the first time in what felt like ages, the morning carried a sense of possibility rather than dread. Emily's soft footsteps on the stairs drew my attention, and when she appeared, her hair tousled from sleep, I greeted her with a warm smile. "Good morning, Emily," I said. "Did you sleep well?" She nodded shyly, her hands clutching the hem of her oversized sweater. "The bed was really soft," she murmured. "I'm glad," I replied. "Come sit. Breakfast is ready." I'd prepared scrambled eggs and toast. A simple meal. But Emily's eyes widened as though I'd served her a feast. She sat quietly at the table, eating with the careful precision of someone who was unaccustomed to such care. Watching her, I realized how much she had likely gone without, not just in terms of material comforts, but in the warmth of a home, the stability of routine, and the simple joy of knowing she mattered to someone. After breakfast, I suggested we take a walk to the park nearby. Emily hesitated at first but eventually agreed. As we strolled through the leafy paths, I pointed out familiar sights: the pond where James and I used to sit and feed the ducks, the old oak tree where he'd carved our initials so many years ago. Emily listened intently, her small face thoughtful. "Did he talk about me a lot?" she asked suddenly, her voice hesitant. I stopped walking and knelt to her level, placing a hand on her shoulder. James thought the world of you, I said. He loved you very much, Emily. He wanted us to be a family. But he didn't get the chance to tell me. I'm sorry it took me so long to find you. Her lips quivered. And for a moment, I thought she might cry. But she simply nodded and took my hand. Over the following days, Emily and I began to fall into a rhythm. I showed her how to bake James's favorite apple pie, and she shared stories of the times James had visited her at the orphanage. She spoke of how he would sit with her, reading aloud from books or teaching her how to skip stones during their outings. He always said I'd make a good daughter, Emily whispered one evening as we cleaned up after dinner. I swallowed the lump in my throat, my heart aching with a mixture of sadness and gratitude. And he was right, I told her. As we continued to bond, I saw Emily's reserved demeanor start to soften. She laughed more often, a sound that filled the house with life again. She began to decorate her room, adding drawings to the walls and a small collection of stuffed animals James had given her over the years. Each day brought new challenges and moments of discovery. There were times when Emily withdrew, struggling with fears and uncertainties that lingered from her time in the orphanage. I learned to comfort her, to offer her patience and understanding rather than answers. Through it all, I felt James's presence guiding us, his dream slowly coming to fruition. Emily was becoming part of my life in a way that felt natural and right. She wasn't just a reminder of James, she was her own person, full of hopes and dreams that I now felt privileged to nurture. One evening, as we sat together on the couch, Emily leaned her head against my shoulder. Do you think James would be proud of us? She asked softly. Tears stung my eyes, but I smiled. I think he already is, I said. And in that moment, I knew that the new chapter we were beginning was one James had always believed we could write together. As the days turned into weeks, the bond between Emily and me deepened. Every interaction felt like we were discovering something new about each other, filling the empty spaces that grief and loneliness had left in both of our hearts. Our days became a tapestry of shared experiences, each thread weaving us closer together. One crisp afternoon, I decided to take Emily shopping for her new room. She was hesitant at first, unsure about expressing her preferences. But I gently encouraged her. This is your space, Emily, I said as we walked through the store. You can make it anything you want. She hesitated in front of a display of brightly colored bedspreads, her fingers grazing the fabric of a soft lavender quilt. Do you think James would like this? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I crouched down beside her, smiling. James would love anything that makes you happy, I said. Her small smile was a reward worth more than words. We left the store with the lavender quilt, matching curtains, and a few other decorations, including a small lamp shaped like a butterfly. Watching her excitement as we set up her room was like witnessing a flower bloom. Her space transformed into a reflection of her personality, a mix of gentle colors, whimsical touches, and warmth. Emily's nervousness began to melt away during our outings. One day, we visited the local park, where I encouraged her to join the children playing on the swings. She was hesitant at first, standing on the sidelines and clutching my hand. But after a bit of gentle coaxing, she climbed onto a swing, her laughter ringing out as she soared higher and higher. That was fun, she exclaimed afterward, her cheeks flushed with happiness. Moments like these reminded me of James's words in the letters I had found, that Emily was filled with light and resilience. Even after all she had been through, it was as though he had seen a part of her that was now beginning to shine more brightly each day. Yet, there were challenges, too. Emily struggled with fears that surfaced at night. On several occasions, she woke up from nightmares, her small cries echoing through the quiet house. Each time, I would rush to her room, holding her close and whispering soothing words until she calmed down. You're safe here, Emily, I would assure her. You're not alone anymore. Those moments were both heartbreaking and humbling, as I realized how much she had carried on her young shoulders. But they also strengthened our connection, showing her that she could rely on me, just as James had envisioned. The adoption process moved forward steadily, with regular visits from social workers and meetings with Mrs. Andrews. Each step brought us closer to making Emily's place in my home and my heart official. One evening, as Emily helped me prepare dinner, she paused and looked up at me. "Do you think I'll really belong here?" she asked, her voice tinged with vulnerability. I knelt beside her, taking her hands in mine. "You already do, Emily," I said firmly. "This is your home, and you are loved." Her smile, shy but genuine, was all the reassurance I needed that we were on the right path. Slowly but surely, we were becoming a family. The day Emily's adoption was finalized marked a turning point, a moment where the past, present, and future seemed to converge. Standing in the courthouse, holding her small hand in mine, I felt a surge of emotions I couldn't quite put into words. Pride, relief, and an overwhelming sense of love filled me as the judge smiled and declared us officially a family. Emily looked up at me with wide, shimmering eyes, and in that moment, it was as if James was there, quietly nodding his approval. "We did it," I whispered, squeezing her hand. Her voice was soft but sure. "We're a family now." Afterward, we returned home and shared a quiet celebration. Just the two of us. I had baked a cake, lemon, James's favorite, as a small way of honoring him. Emily helped me decorate it with white camellias. A flower I had discovered was symbolic of love and remembrance. It was a simple but heartfelt tribute. And as we sat at the table together, I couldn't help but think of James and how his dream had led us here. Later that week, Emily and I visited James's grave together for the first time. I had told her about the plan to plant white camellias near his resting place, and she had eagerly agreed, her youthful enthusiasm blending with a deep understanding far beyond her years. The cemetery was quiet that morning, the air crisp with the scent of pine and damp earth. Emily carried a small spade and a bag of bulbs, and I held the camellia plant carefully in its pot. Together, we worked side by side, preparing the soil and gently placing the plant into the ground. As she patted the dirt into place, Emily looked up at me. "Do you think James knows?" she asked softly. I smiled, my heart full of an aching but beautiful gratitude. "I think he does, Emily. And I think he's very proud of you." We stood there for a long moment, gazing at the newly planted flowers. It was as if we were connecting with James in a way that transcended time and loss, finding a sense of peace together. Over the following months, our lives began to settle into a rhythm. Emily's laughter filled the house, and her presence brought a warmth I hadn't realized I was missing. We developed small rituals, Sunday pancakes, bedtime stories, and regular visits to the cemetery to tend to James's camellias. Every day, I saw more of James in Emily, not just in her love for life, but in her strength and ability to bring joy even in the face of adversity. She became a living testament to his enduring legacy, a reminder of the love he had left behind. For Emily and me, James's dream had become our reality. Together, we were building a life rooted in resilience, hope, and the unshakable bond of family. As I watched Emily flourish, I knew that in honoring James's legacy, we had found a way to move forward, united by love and the promise of a new beginning.